I'm not too familiar with both of those organizations. I know we had facilitators from Men Against Violence stand up. I wonder if we could just see a show of hands of the people who are directly connected to or members of women in networking. Can I see hands? Everyone here is a member of Women in Networking. And for those of you who are a member of Men Against Violence, is that a separate? A subset. So who are the members of Men Against Violence? Okay, so it's mostly the people who stood earlier. Okay, great. Just wanting to get the lay of the land a little bit. So my name is Giordano. I'm the Director of Training at Men Stopping Violence. I've been on staff at Men Stopping Violence for the last 5.5 years. I started as an intern about 13 years ago. So I've been doing this work for a little while. Men Stopping Violence started in 1982. They've been in existence for 33 years. And they were begun by two men who were therapists in the Atlanta community and wanted to figure out how they could support the battered women's movement. What could they do to help end violence against women and create safer communities for women and girls? They approached a director of a shelter in Metro Atlanta, and when they said they wanted to help, her suggestion was that they should be working with men. The idea at the time was that since men are the primary perpetrators of violence against women, that men should take responsibility for changing the dynamics of violence, to work with men so that they're no longer abusive. So we've continued that work for 33 years, and we refer to that as intervention, so intervening with men after they've been violent. Part of what I'm going to be talking about today is the promising practices and lessons learned from that 33 years experience. But in the last 33 years, we've also developed our analysis and changed our approach in ways. So we've also begun to focus on prevention. And we know that we don't want to always respond after the fact. We want to make sure that we're stopping men from being abusive in the first place. And I will also be talking about a couple of our programs that do just that. So over the 33 years we've been in existence, we have made mistakes, we've learned lessons, and we've developed a set of 7 core principles. And I'm going to use those 7 core principles today to talk about the best practices of men stopping violence. The hope is that I can talk about the experience I bring from the United States, and you all will be able to pull out of that experience what you think will work for you here in Mauritius. I'm excited that there's momentum here in getting men involved. It's something that's, we may have been doing it for a long time in the United States, but it's hard work. Sometimes it's really uplifting, sometimes it feels very defeating. So I hope that me being here is one of those moments where you're feeling supported and you're feeling connected to a worldwide movement of men who are interested in creating safer communities for women and girls. The mission of Men Stopping Violence is particularly to organize men to end violence against women. We do that through educating men, we do that through advocating with men, and we do that through creating programs that will engage men. 2 primary programs that I want to talk about are our Men at Work Building Safe Communities program. That's an educational class that men who have been abusive, it's our intervention class, can come, and it's a 24-week class where a man comes for 2 hours once a week for 24 weeks. It's educational, but it's also designed to hold men responsible for their abusive behavior. So we see accountability for an individual's abusive behavior as one of the most important things we can do to help create safety for women and girls. But we also want to take the opportunity, when we have the men in the room, to educate them about domestic violence and find ways to educate their community about domestic violence. So we work hard to intertwine prevention and intervention in our 24-week class. And we require any man who wants to complete that class to go back into their community and have conversations with men in their community about what they're learning in class. We also require that they bring those men, they have to connect with at least 4 men, and they have to bring 2 of them back into our class to witness the accountability process. So we often hear from the men who've never been arrested, who would be seen as upstanding, great community members, that they have work to do to look at their abusive and controlling behaviors as well. And that's one of our main core values, is that we are the work. We see that for all men who have been socialized in a patriarchal society, we have work to do to unlearn what we've internalized about our male dominance. And so at Men Stopping Violence, we know that every staff member, every intern, every volunteer, and every man in the community can do work to figure out how to show up better and more respectfully in their relationships with everyone, and particularly with women. So I'm going to start the conversation about our first core principle, we are the work, by looking at an activity we do, a spectrum of interpersonal violence. And this spectrum attempts to rank abusive tactics. So you heard earlier that I'm going to be talking about tactics and intimidation. This is the primary place that I'll have that conversation. So if you look from the right to the left, we've ranked abusive tactics from what may be least severe on the right to most severe on the left. Now, we have to acknowledge that if we look at how women are affected by violence, that they don't often line up in a specific spectrum or continuum like this. But for the purpose of a conversation I want to have, we've done this. And so if I were to ask you where you would say in Mauritius, if you went out into the community and you asked people, which of these behaviors would be considered gender-based violence? And we do this a lot in the United States. And I've done this since I've been here and found that the answers are very similar in the United States as they are in Mauritius. And often, people identify gender-based violence as the physical abuse, right? It's not problematic until there's some level of physical violence that is used. And this is exactly how people in the United States think about it, and yet this is one of the most problematic parts of our approach to ending violence against women or gender-based violence. So one of the things that's problematic about this is it completely takes the effect of violence out of the scenario. Okay? So if we're worried about violence as a control tactic used by men, then we can look at these behaviors, and even if they're to the right side of this gray line, we know that they can be used to control very effectively, right? And so what our society is doing in the US, and I think also in Mauritius, is telling men in our communities what level of control is acceptable, right? You can control women as long as you don't do anything too egregious, as long as you don't use physical violence, right? And so what some men learn, is that they can get away with abuse as long as they do it the right way. One of the things that men learn after they've been arrested is they can continue to abuse, they can continue to intimidate, as long as they don't re-abuse physically. But what that means is because they've already abused physically in the first place, they don't need to do it again, because now they just have to threaten to do it, or they just have to remind their partner that they've done it and that it's possible, right? So if we're really interested in ending violence against women and creating safer communities for women, we can't draw a line here and say some violence is important to deal with and some we can look the other way. In the United States, this line is the line between the behaviors that are criminalized and the behaviors that are not criminalized. The other problem with this is that most women never report their abuse to police. So if we're relying on the criminal legal system for our solution to violence against women, then we're never going to arrest all the men that we think we should be arresting for committing acts of violence. So most violence isn't criminalized. Even the violence that is criminalized, there isn't a consequence for men because women don't report it, because the police respond and minimize it. And so, again, this dichotomy really sets us up to fail if we're interested in ending violence against women. The third reason, and really what gets us to the concept of we are the work, is that it creates a dichotomy between good men and bad men. And so the bad men are the men who are arrested. They're the men who often find themselves in our intervention class. And we see them as doing something horrible, and they should either be locked up or they should experience some extreme negative consequence. And then the good men are the men who we see in the community who we would never assume would commit an act of violence. But what we actually know through our practice is that a batterer, or someone we label as a batterer, can come to our class and do great work, be accountable for his behavior, learn a lot about violence against women, and change who he is and how he interacts with women. And as that change takes place, he becomes a really powerful advocate for our cause. And so I said earlier that Men Stopping Violence is interested in organizing men to end violence against women. One of the ways we do that is we use this educational opportunity that we get with abusive men, and we turn them into advocates. We organize them so that they're now out in the community, they're volunteering for us, they're well educated about violence against women, they're being accountable for their past abuse and on an ongoing basis for any current abusive behaviors they're using. And we're creating a community of men who are outspoken about violence against women. They often go to the legislature and lobby for laws that are important. They're out in the community talking to other men. They give presentations. They help us disseminate our information into the community. So this is a model that we think is powerful, but it wouldn't be possible if we thought that batterers weren't redeemable. We thought batterers were always and already violent and couldn't be changed. And so one of the key ideas that Men Stopping Violence brings to the movement is that when we set high expectations for men, men will reach those expectations. When we have low expectations for men, then they may not try, but we're also not investing in them, so we're not going to get much out of them either. So the other side of this is that we look at the men who've never been arrested, the men that we want to engage in our prevention programs, in our initiatives, as our allies. And at Men Stopping Violence, we've continually had the experience that men who we engage as allies are also engaging at different levels in abusive and controlling behavior. So we've been set up to be blindsided time and time again because we invest in the man who has the right analysis, who knows how to say the right things, but when it comes down to his interpersonal relationships, he's doing all the same things that men do in our classrooms. And so we're clear that this dichotomy sets us up to fail. We can't divide men into good men or bad men. We have to think of all men as being socialized in communities that are patriarchal, and all men have internalized those messages about dominating women. Some of them are conscious, some of them are subconscious, but there needs to be a process that men go through to figure out what they've internalized and how that's showing up in their life. And so what we do at Men Stopping Violence is any man who's interested in working with us has to go through our 24-week class. As a staff member, and as any staff member who works with us, they all have to spend at least 6 months going through our 24-week class. Our interns have to do the same thing. Our volunteers have to do that as well. For me, as an intern 13 years ago, this was surprising. I came to Men Stopping Violence having taken a lot of feminist studies classes, feeling like I had read the right books. I was friends with many feminists. I thought I knew the issues inside and out. I go to Men Stopping Violence thinking that they were going to be excited that someone like me wanted to help their cause. And they said, before you can do anything visible in the community, you have to do your personal work. I had this idea that the men in this class were monsters, that I would have nothing in common with them, that I would be terrified the minute I walked in the room. And I was completely surprised that when I walked in the room, it was a room of men that I could have met anywhere on the street, right? And so that was the first understanding that I came to doing the work. I then quickly realized that I had a lot of work to do in that space, and that this idea that I am the work, we are the work, was really relevant. And because I've had that experience, and that because I've learned to be accountable, I'm not perfect, I mess up, but when I do mess up, I'm able to talk about that and be accountable for how I messed up and how I hurt people. And because I've learned that process, I am now a better advocate for the work that Men Stopping Violence does. And so the invitation is to figure out what are the processes that you all can put in place to have a similar experience for men, because I think that it's so valuable. So the second core value I want to talk about is community accountability is key to ending violence against women. So some of you were with me on Monday and you saw the presentation I did on community accountability. The basic idea of community accountability is that while individuals are committing acts of violence, it's the communities that are supporting those acts. It's the community that is training men to be violent. We talk a lot about the socialization process and how gender roles are designed in many ways to enforce a power dynamic between men and women, with men having more power than women. And if we want to end violence against women, we need to hold the community accountable for how they're abusive and controlling, or how they're training men to be abusive and controlling. But the flip side of that is that we should also have expectations of our community that they hold men accountable when they act out abusively. So in the United States, as I was saying, we rely too heavily on the criminal justice system to create accountability, and they're too limited to do that fully. But what if we had mechanisms in our community that would allow faith communities to step in when they hear violence is happening? What if we could have educational institutions step in when they hear violence is happening, or workplaces, or just men on the street having conversations with each other about violence? And so that's one of the key ideas that Men Stopping Violence brings to our work. When we set up our 24-week educational program, we were clear that we didn't want to rely only on the criminal justice system. Because most men don't go through that system, we didn't want to set ourselves up to miss most men. So we started to set up relationships with the faith community, with workplaces, with therapeutic communities and counselors, with educational institutions. And so about half of the men who come to our class are never arrested, but they're referred by some other community institution. Okay? And they have consequences in place that mean if they don't show up, then the community holds them responsible. So a faith community will say, you can't worship here anymore unless you are accountable for your abusive behavior at Men Stopping Violence. Or an educational institution will put someone on probation until they complete our class. Or a workplace will put someone on administrative leave or suspend their employment until they complete our class. And so there's a lot of ideas that we can put into practice that help us better address violence when we think outside the box and aren't focused on the criminal justice system as the only place accountability happens, but are thinking more about how other places in the community can help us build accountability for men. So connected to our analysis of community accountability is that patriarchal violence, and patriarchy is at the root of violence against women. So this idea that women are inherently less valuable than men is the justification for men to control women, and is the justification for violence and control in relationships. But we don't just look at domestic violence or sexual violence as the issues that we need to take on. So at Men Stopping Violence, we're really interested in the other ways that patriarchy shows up in women's lives and creates violence for them. So we spend a lot of time thinking about street harassment. Right? It's not interpersonal violence, but it's a level of violence that women are navigating every day of their lives. And it's a place that men can raise their voice and have a huge impact on. So in our idea of community accountability, we have conversations with men about how do you talk to your friends when they're harassing women on the street. Right? There's a wonderful campaign in the United States that is international in some ways that you may have heard of, called Stop Telling Women to Smile. And so there's this idea that men are out in the community, attractive, or a woman that they find attractive walks by, and all they say is smile, right? Or smile and then add another word to it. And women are feeling harassed by that, rightly so. And men aren't seeing that. Men are thinking, well, I'm paying them a compliment. Right? But when we talk to men about what that means and how women potentially feel unsafe, it's a very easy thing to get men not to do, right? And so caring about these other issues beyond domestic violence and sexual violence are places where we can have an impact if we're willing to have tough conversations with other men. We're also very interested in thinking about reproductive justice. And this is an issue that often there's a division between domestic violence in the United States and reproductive justice. Yet the violence that occurs in both spheres are very overlapping. And so we want to make sure that we're not choosing the easy issues to tackle, but we're addressing all the issues that have the underlying issue of patriarchy at its root. We don't want to just put band-aids on problems. We want to think about how do we change the culture in the United States so that our society isn't organized in a patriarchal way. The fourth core principle that I'm talking about is organizing men takes precedence over intervening with men. So like I said, we started 33 years ago intervening with men and just tackling the problem after violence has already happened, hoping from stopping men from committing further acts of violence. But what we now focus on is activating men so that they are taking active roles in their community to prevent violence. We have another program called Because We Have Daughters. Some of you saw or heard me talk about it on Monday. Some of you may even be there tomorrow when we're going to be conducting a Because We Have Daughters session at the ambassador's house. This is a program that came around because we were asking what could be the impetus to get more men involved in preventing violence against women. And you often hear, well, men should care about this issue because they have daughters, because they have sisters, because they have mothers. And theoretically, that makes sense. What's hard to hear about that is men should also care about violence because they respect their partners and don't, that should be enough to stop violence. Often it's not. So we were strategic in creating a program that would pull on a man's paternalistic values in wanting to protect his daughter, and would be a way to activate him and get him involved more deeply in ending violence against women. So what we do in this program is we get fathers and daughters together for an afternoon or a morning of fun activities. We build their communication skills, we help them bond, and through this bonding and through the communication skills that we're building, fathers begin to hear what it's like to grow up as a young woman in the United States. And he begins to hear that it's tough to navigate the bullying she experiences at school. It's tough to navigate the body image issues she gets from looking at the media and from other women and adults in her life. The eating disorders that she struggles with. The dating violence that she's dealing with in her relationships with boys and men. And so fathers are hearing this and are outraged by it, are surprised by it, because up until this point, the daughter never thought that the father cared about these issues. So we talk to dads about what they can do when they hear this from their daughter, and how it's not possible to be with their daughter at all times, to keep her safe from these things. But if they invest in creating safer communities for all women, then by default, their daughters will be safer. So this is an impactful program, and we've greatly increased our numbers at Men Stopping Violence because we've included these fathers who are now interested in creating safer communities for their daughters and all women. So I want to show a quick clip of Because We Have Daughters sessions, about 5 minutes. It just takes highlights from one session, and it can be something that we talk a little bit about during the question and answer section in a few minutes when I get to that.
Because We Have Daughters is fun, really a sharp program that runs well and that people can do.
It's a unique program that's designed strictly for dads and daughters. We want to create leadership skills where they can feel safe using their voice at any time and feel comfortable in doing so.
There was a time 6 years ago when we were having a discussion about why would men want to get involved in ending violence against women. And one of the obvious reasons is because they have daughters, and they have sisters, and they have mothers, and they have friends, and they have coworkers. But daughters have a special place in men's hearts.
So what we're going to talk about in this group is the core values that we're going to be doing today and how they relate to the activities. Who remembers one of the core values? Listening. That's very important. And we're intentional about the activities that we have, like the bridge building activity. We're intentional about that. And how they actually going to work is
Started by two white men. And as they began to develop their practice, they were interested in being inclusive to all communities. But what they found along the way is that because they were coming from a perspective of the dominant race in the United States, that they had limitations in how accessible the programs that they were creating were to communities of color, and how comfortable communities of color were in engaging those services. Over the years, Men Stopping Violence has grown, and about 20 years ago, a group of African American women came to us, or came to Men Stopping Violence, and wanted to have a conversation about how we're addressing domestic violence in African American communities. One of their concerns was that it looks different when an African American man is abusive to his African American partner than it does in the white community, and that the intervention, the process of intervention, should also reflect that, and that we should be responsive to those differences in those communities. So we started an initiative where we explored with those African American women and a couple African American men on staff what some of the best solutions, what are the best ways to better serve the African American community. So one of the things that we had to be clear about is if we're interested in creating safer communities for women and girls, we need to make sure that we're talking about all women and all girls, and that we have to be explicit at the racial differences that are inherent in our communities. And one of the things that we found is often there's a difference in how communities of color are policed and how white communities are policed in the United States. And that often white men aren't held as accountable as men of color are, and that injustices are happening to men of color through the criminal justice system. As an organization that gets about half of its men into its intervention program through the criminal justice system, we needed to figure out a way that we weren't furthering the injustices that were happening. One of the things that we did is we began to incorporate more culturally relevant components into our curriculum, so that African American men would feel like they were at home and welcomed into the classes. We also started a class just for African American men to do their intervention and education work, the 24-week class. We often get the question, well, why are you segregating African American men? It's not segregation. We created the class, and men can choose to enroll in that class if they're African American, or they can choose to enroll in one of our multiracial classes. But what we began to understand through the African American initiative is that men of color are there to be accountable for how they've been violent to women, but they're having to navigate racism within the classroom that undermines their accountability process. They're being protective against men's assumptions about them and aren't able to be fully open and present in the accountability process. So if we create a space where, in some ways, racism isn't a hurdle for them, they're more able to do the work that they need to be doing in our class. And what we've begun to know we need to do is we need to say we're creating safer communities for all women, but we really need to center women of color in that statement. And so we're working to create safe communities for women of color and girls of color. And when we change that statement with just that little addition, we center our practice on a much better focus. And so since the start of the African American Initiative, we've continued to pay attention to how we're supporting communities of color. You saw in the Because We Have Daughters session that we use facilitators that are representative of the communities that we're working with. So we have plenty of facilitators of color trained to run Because We Have Daughters, and we have white facilitators, and we facilitate across race often. We're focused on communities of color often, not because they're more violent, but because they often have less services and don't get the benefit of services like Because We Have Daughters. And so by focusing them, we feel like we've made a commitment to saying to the community that race matters. But we didn't just stop at race matters. We also began to realize that we need to look at all systems of oppression. So race matters, so does class, so does sexual orientation, so does ability, so does education. All of these things matter in how we approach our work. And we've begun to see that while we're working to end sexism in our communities, we also need to be working to end racism, heterosexism, and classism in the rest of the isms in the United States. A great example of why this is so important is when we have classes where we bring men together and expect them to be vulnerable with each other. It's hard to do initially because men don't have the experience of being open to each other. They've had the experience throughout their life that when they share, when they're open, when they're vulnerable with each other, that they get picked on or bullied or abused in some way. And that experience is directly a result of sexism and heterosexism. And so if we're not addressing heterosexism in our classroom, even if there's no gay men present, then we're undermining our goals of creating a space that all men can equally participate. We need men to be vulnerable. We need men to take risks if they're going to be accountable for their abuse, if they're going to talk about their relationships, if they're going to talk about the terrible things that they've done in those relationships. And if we allow homophobia and heterosexism to enter into the room, then we've made that process harder. Men are going to be guarded. Men aren't going to feel safe opening up to each other. Men aren't going to feel safe calling each other on the phone during the week or supporting each other through giving each other feedback during the class. I could tell similar stories about the other systems of oppression, like ableism and how that's important to address in our class, and classism and how that's important, for similar reasons and for very different reasons. So when we look at our community accountability model, we're not just thinking about how do we create communities that are safer for men or for women and girls, but also for women of color and girls of color, like I said, but also lesbian and gay men, or women of color, or men of color. So we're thinking about how all these things work together, and that's why we're saying that intersectionality matters. All of these systems of repression are interconnected. We need to be paying attention to that. So finally, one of our most important core principles is that women's voices have to be central to the work that we do. As men, it can be really easy to get away from listening to the realities of women and coming up with great ideas about what we need to be doing to create safety for women. But we found at Men Stopping Violence, when we do that, when we don't check out our ideas and initiatives with women, we're sometimes out of touch with what will actually be helpful in our communities. So we started 33 years ago by two men, but they started in collaboration with a woman, and we're very clear that if they were going to do this as men, they needed to make sure that they were accountable to women. The African American Initiative that I spoke about began because women of color spoke up and said that we needed to do things differently. And because we knew that women of color's voices were so important, we listened to them, we started the initiative, and we made the changes that they said needed to be done. We need to acknowledge that women have been working in this movement and doing incredible work for a long time. And that as men, we come into that movement, we come into that history, and we can learn from that history. One of the concerns early on in this movement is that men weren't always welcome, because there was a fear that they would come and take it over, or they would come and dominate, do all the things that they do in their interpersonal relationships or other places in the community. So we center this core principle to always remind ourselves that as we're looking at ourselves and the work that we do, we need to make sure that women's voices are at the center, and that we look to women's leadership for direction. So we have women in leadership positions at Men Stopping Violence. We are very clear that we should have men who are visible in the community talking about violence to other men, and we should be visible so that it makes it more obvious that this is an issue that men should care about. Yet we don't do that without the support and without the direction of women in our lives and women in our organization. So one of the things that I like to do is anytime that I'm talking to groups, I like to include information or activities or resources that can be useful in your conversations with men. I like to end presentations with women's voices. So clearly, there's no one else here for Men Stopping Violence, but there is a video that I like to show of a spoken word poet that really impactfully talks about violence against women and girls. So I want to leave it with her voice, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers about Men Stopping Violence. One thing I will say is that it's a moving poem.
Away. Not even a chance. That I dare for even a second glance at the reflection of my body in the mirror, and she knows why. Like I know why she only cries when she feels like she's about to lose control. She knows how much control is worth. Knows what a woman can lose when her power to move is taken away by a grip so thick with hate it could clip the wings of God. Leave the next 8 generations of your blood shaken, and tonight, something inside me is breaking. My heart beating so deep beneath the sheets of her pain, I could give every tear she's crying a year, a name, and a face I forever erase from her mind if I could, just like she would for me or you. But how much closer to free would any of us be if even a few of us forgot what too many women in this world cannot? And I'm thinking, what the hell would you tell your daughter, your someday daughter, when you'd have to hold her beautiful face to the beat up face of this place that hasn't learned the meaning of stop? Stop! What would you tell your daughter of the womb raped empty? The eyes swollen shut, the gut too frightened to hold food, the thousands upon thousands of bodies used and abused. It was 7 minutes of the worst kind of hell. 7. And she stopped believing in heaven. Distrust became her law, fear her Bible. The only chance of survival, don't trust any of them. Bolt the doors to your home, iron get your windows, walk into the car alone, get the keys in the lock, please, 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 please open. Like already you can feel that 5-finger noose around your neck, 200 pounds of hatred engraved into the sacred soil of your flesh, please, 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 please open. Already you're choking for your breath, listening for the broken record of the defense. Answer the question, answer the question, answer the question, miss, why? Am I on trial for this? Would you talk to your sister, your daughter, your mother like this? I am generations of sisters, daughters, mothers, our bodies, battlefields, war grounds beneath the weapons of your brother's hands. You know they found landmines and broken women's souls. Black holes in the parts of their hearts that once sang symphonies of creation bright as the light on infinity's halo. She says